I suppose pre-AI, and for a lot of us who grew up in the geospatial industry, we could trust the data that we were using because we knew its origins. If you sort of fast forward to where we are now with the advent and involvement of AI, kind of the rules have changed. So I guess increasingly we're seeing that geospatial data and that spatial data being inferred rather than being measured, and increasingly it's being, I guess for want of a better word, synthesized rather than surveyed. Yeah, there's enough examples, and that's where the authenticity piece comes in, where AI is really maybe making mistakes or even fabricating geography, creating geography that wasn't there.
WGIC Horizons, a podcast for latest technology, business, partnerships and policy trends in geospatial industry.
Hello and welcome to Horizons, the World Geospatial Industry Council. Our guest today is John Renard, founder, Airedale Advisory, and chair of WGIC's Data Committee. John, thank you so much for joining this conversation.
Thank you very much, Banu. Delighted to be online.
I want to start by asking about the genesis of this committee within WGIC. We all know data is the bedrock of geospatial industry, and all businesses deal with it directly or indirectly. WGIC was started in 2018, and 6 years after, the members felt that a dedicated committee on geospatial data is required. Why is that so? Can you take us through the journey?
Data is the bedrock, or as we like to think of it in the committee, or I like to think of it as data is the soil that holds the sort of the geospatial ecosystem together and sort of allows all the ideas and decisions that we make using that data. So yes, I guess it's quite surprising, given that the data that WGIC existed for so long, that we didn't have a data committee. But I suppose the origin came specifically from one of our patron board members, and his company captures and processes large volumes of geospatial data. And I think he had a very strong view, and various other of us who joined the committee early on shared that view, that there were a lot of inconsistencies around how geospatial data was procured and commercialized. And in particular, the challenges dealing with large government procurements of geospatial data sets and issues around currency and pricing and repeatability. So that's really where we started. So on the back of that initiative, we stood up the committee, and I'm delighted to say, yeah, we're going and we're getting stronger and stronger. But it was really from that core idea of looking at how data was procured and commercialized.
That's true. One of the reasons why I'm having this conversation is to understand the current dynamic the geospatial data is having. WGIC has members that span across the entire value chain of geospatial data, right from data acquisition, processing, services, solutions, and products as well. Coming off artificial intelligence, getting into the geospatial workflows, how is it transforming geospatial businesses? And what are some of the pertinent issues the Data Committee has identified to work on?
Great question. So I suppose just picking up from what I said about where we started. So one of the first things we did as a committee, we reached out to all the members and we ran a survey in August 24, and we talked to all the members and said, what are the issues that are relevant for you and what's pertinent? And I guess AI was certainly on the radar then, but we got a whole range of things and we tried to rank them. And I suppose over the last 18 months since then, we've really focused down on two particular issues, and I think they're very, very pertinent to your question around AI. And one is around this whole topic of data authenticity, which I'll explain a little bit more. And the other one, and I think we'll probably cover in our conversation, is data sovereignty. So those are our sort of two, if you like, overriding themes. And that's not to say things like our original focus around procurement and sharing of data, interoperability. Those are all topics that are there and that are relevant, but we thought it was useful to focus on a couple of overriding themes. So I suppose to look at sort of your question around the impact of AI. So I suppose the first comment to say is, again, we're very lucky within WGIC, and I'd say possibly unique in the sense that we have two major strengths. One, we're a group of purely commercial organizations, and we're commercial geospatial organizations. So that's one of our strengths. And the second thing that I think then, if you combine the two, that really makes us unique is that we have literally every stage of the value chain around geospatial covered. So that can be from companies who manufacture the information and the sensors and the equipment for capturing the data, to companies who are actually undertaking the data capture or the aerial acquisition or the earth observation or operating and flying satellites, to the companies who are then extracting and processing that information, to companies who are involved in the AI and the algorithms and the machine learning to extract the data and give us the insights, through to companies who are providing the analytics and the platforms to do the data analysis. So I think that puts us in a really strong position to understand kind of what's coming downstream, and when we look at those topics like data authenticity and data sovereignty, to really understand what they mean for the industry and what we can be doing about them. So to take your question around the impact of AI, I suppose a good way of thinking about it and where we're trying to sort of frame it is, I like to think we're moving from a world of sort of measurement-based trust to one where we need to build model-based trust. And maybe if I could just explain what I mean by that in a bit more detail. So I suppose pre-AI, and for a lot of us who grew up in the geospatial industry, we could trust the data that we were using because we knew its origins. We knew how it's produced. We knew the source materials. We knew who did the work. We knew exactly the resolution. We knew there'd be ground control. We knew exactly the accuracy. So trust was implicit in the process, and it was really built on very clear and measurable outcomes. So assuming that the process was followed and everyone had done their job correctly, we knew that this was an accurate representation of the real world as we wanted it, as we needed it for any particular application. If you sort of fast forward to where we are now with the advent and involvement of AI, kind of the rules have changed. So I guess increasingly we're seeing that geospatial data and that spatial data being inferred rather than being measured. And increasingly it's being, I guess for want of a better word, synthesized rather than surveyed. So we're dealing now with multiple sources of information. We're dealing with huge amounts of data that we don't necessarily know quite the source. We don't know who's created it. We don't know how it's been captured. It's being ingested and processed without, in many cases, any human intervention. So that whole relationship where we had surveyors and engineers and people interpreting rules, that no longer implies. AI is doing that, and sometimes AI might do that very logically and correctly. But yeah, there's enough examples, and that's where the authenticity piece comes in, where AI is really maybe making mistakes or even fabricating geography or creating geography that wasn't there. So we have this issue where how can we trust the data? We don't really know the process, and we don't know the people, we don't know the inputs, and therefore we have to build our trust, or the view that we're building, and certainly my view is that we have to build our trust not on the measurement and the people involved, but on the process and on the machines and on the model used, that will give us the confidence to say, well, actually, yes, this AI generated data might not be perfect, but we know the model, we can trust the model, and therefore we can trust the outcome. I hope that makes sense.
Yes, it absolutely makes sense. And you are very bang on when you said our relationship with data itself is changing, especially with the advent of artificial intelligence. And that's eroding the trust at some levels.
Yes.
So what can we do to restore trust, including embedding the authenticity into geospatial data?
I think there's many things we can do. And, again, I think as the WGIC, we're in a really strong position to look at this, because ultimately it's going to come from industry-wide collaboration. It's going to be driven by multiple stakeholders, and because we have that. I mentioned earlier, I hesitate to use the word unique because there's very few things are unique, but we have that very strong position as WGIC of being commercial organizations and having a view across the whole value chain, is that we're, I think, in a very strong position to be able to understand what that industry-wide collaboration might look like, and also for example, one of the areas where we're discussing within the data committee, also learning from things that are happening in academia, but not necessarily purely around geospatial, but how these issues of authenticity, trust, sovereignty are being looked at through academia, and how they're dealing with some of the issues around AI generated data, to understand what that means within our context. So I think absolutely confident that trust can be rebuilt, but I don't think it's about going back to past methods. It's really by focusing on kind of well-defined end user cases. It's around industry-wide collaboration, and really then I guess building on that, things like data governance, interoperability, all the other good things that are there, but maybe fine-tuning them and refining them for the current environment we live in, rather than maybe the environment we were in several years ago.
Aspect you spoke about is about data sovereignty.
Yeah.
Where and how does data sovereignty fit into this picture of geospatial data plus AI? And what can we do to ensure that this is respected without undermining the quality or the value of the data?
Yeah, no, great question. So I think we felt, authenticity, we've touched on a little bit, and I think that's goes hand in hand with data sovereignty, because again, the issues of trust have been undermined to a large extent by technology. But if you look at the impact of technology, especially things like cloud and satellite imagery, Earth observation, etc., as well as AI, that's had a huge impact on data sovereignty. So again, if you look at it very simplistically, in the old days, if you had your national mapping, you could have all your national mapping created in your country, on your servers, behind your firewalls, on your premises, and life was relatively contained and manageable. You look at what's happening now, and also, again, if you go back to the way that the data was created, you knew that the data, that you had the best data possible, because as long as you put the investment in the process and the measurement, you would have really good data of your country. Sort of fast forward to where we are now, and if you like, and you bring AI into the picture, well, if you take that same sort of nationalistic approach, one of the big issues you're going to get is, or we feel it's going to be a key issue, is you're going to have this idea of sort of AI silos. So, for example, if you work on the premise that AI generally gets smarter the more data it consumes, if you're having every country, doing AI for its own data within its own country, behind its firewall, in their sovereign state, clearly we're not going to get the best outcomes at a global level of AI. So how do you address that risk of, if you like, creating inferior data sets because of the issues of sovereignty? So that's one thing that we're looking at. So how do you address that issue of quality, interoperability, and value of data? Second one is, again, if you look at not just the physical aspects of storage, but also if you look at how the increasing need for data to be shared across boundaries, how do you address that within the confines of sovereignty? So, for example, what are the standards? If each country is collecting their data and building their, training their algorithms, generating the AI models, how will cross-border collaboration, or EU collaboration, or NATO collaboration, whatever it might be, work if you don't have some standards that enable you to share, operate the data above a sovereign level? So again, what does sovereign mean when you still want to have data that's discoverable and usable? And the good news is there's some standards that are coming through and have been put in place that are addressing that. But those are just two examples. But I think the sovereignty piece is really interesting. I think it goes hand in hand, because if the premise is AI works better, the more open and the more users and the more information it can be trained on, then inherently sovereignty becomes potentially a barrier to that.
John, it's fantastic to see how the data committee has picked up very pertinent issues like data sovereignty, data authenticity, and other aspects. But what are some of the ways the data committee is trying to create about these issues, about the concerns that the larger geospatial industry is dealing with right now?
Yeah. So first of all, I think I mentioned we did our survey very early on in our
True.
existence, and I think that's important. And we will go back to the members because ultimately, while we're a passionate group, and there's about we have a dozen core people, and we've got some really good active members within the data committee. Ultimately, we need to reflect the views of the wider membership. So clearly, collaboration with the wider membership. But I think in terms of the specific tools we have and we're working on at the moment, there's really two key focus areas for us at the moment. One is a series of podcasts, and we've already done one again, which kind of introduced some of the wider topics that we've talked about today. We're going to drill down I think we've got our first one at the beginning of next month, where we're going to drill down into the issue of data sovereignty. So we're going to have two experts from different countries facilitating a conversation, really looking at the issues of what data sovereignty means, not only in their context, but globally. So I think that'd be really interesting. We've got another podcast also coming out where we're going to challenge this whole question of data authenticity and throw that out. And I think there'll be several conversations we should have around that. And then what we're trying to do is then pull that together through the second key platform of our work, which is a white paper. And that white paper is really picking up all these themes and really looking at this sort of journey of, in the old days, we could trust data because we knew where it came from, et cetera, et cetera. Now we're in this brave new world of AI generated data. What does that mean? What are the examples we're seeing in the industry? What are our members doing? And what are some of the practical recommendations we can give as a committee to the wider community? The other thing where we've been very lucky, and we've had, I think, in the sort of recent past, two successful collaborations. One back in the autumn at InterGeo, a more recent one at Geo Week in Denver, where we were able to facilitate panel discussions with, I think in both cases, over 100 people in the audience, certainly the one I facilitated when we did it in InterGeo. And that was really, again, looking at this whole journey of data to decisions, and really building on the same themes. We need decision grade data, as Aaron would say, but how do we ensure we have decision grade data and the data is fit for purpose? So that's our other thing. And we will continue to advocate at whatever platforms that the WGIC is participating at and wherever we have the opportunity.
Fantastic. So what are the next logical and sequential things that we can expect from the committee moving forward?
Yeah. So I think you're going to see one or two podcasts coming out quite in the short term. Those are literally scheduled to be recorded in the coming days, and I think to coincide with Horizons, we're aiming to have our first white paper out in time for the Horizons event at the beginning of June.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, John. It's a pleasure talking to you about geospatial data, especially with you who have spent your whole career working with data aspects, your entire career with Infotech and Scient, where we were colleagues. Thank you so much for this conversation.
No, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you very much.
This has been Horizons by WGIC. Like, subscribe and share to help us spread insightful geospatial conversations.